Welcome to the International Forum. So when I wrote to Dr. Perelman about his introduction, I just wanted to say a couple of words about him. He's been here since 1971. That was really nice to hear. And working on his 21st book. Well, so I won't be reading the list of all the books, but I will highlight at least a couple of the books I am familiar with and I really like. But before I do that, I wanted to mention that he did say something really interesting, that he is the best 75-year-old basketball player at the rec. I have to take my hat, you know. I'll get there.
Somebody also responded to me that I was also the worst 75-year-old basketball player at the rec center.
Awesome. So Dr. Perelman is a professor in economics here at Chico State. Some of you may have taken class from him. Some of you know him from reading his book or maybe attending a presentation of his. He travels around the world quite a bit, all over the place. You were just mentioning about his travels to Brazil, and it's only one of the places he's been all over, talking about economics and the impact of globalization, the unintended effects of globalization on local communities. So he earned his degree, Dr. Perelman earned his degree in agricultural economics from the University of California at Berkeley. And that was, he just finished his PhD there, came straight to Chico State in 1971, and he has been with us since. So we're really happy to have him at Chico State. One of his books, actually, his first book was titled Farming for Profit in Hungry World, in a hungry world. It is really, really timing what is taking place today, because today is Labor Day. Cinco de Mayo. Right, Cinco de Mayo. So, and I have the fortune to celebrate Cinco de Mayo 3 times. Brazil, 1st of May, the United States, Cinco de Mayo for Mexico, and then September, right? So today's Labor Day. So anyway, the other book that I wanted to highlight to you, if you decide to go back and check Dr. Perelman's book, is The Perverse Economy, the Impact of Markets on People and Nature. So that was a book written in 2003. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Perelman.
I'm going to take advantage of my age and ask everyone to come up to the front until there are no seats in front of you. It makes it much easier for talking, makes it much easier for listening. So come and help me out. About a year ago, I was invited to give a talk in Turkey about the local effects of globalization. And I was flattered by the invitation, but I had no idea what I would write. It wasn't a subject I thought about. I thought about globalization, but I hadn't thought about the local effects of globalization. So I worked very hard on it. And when I got ready to take it out and run it again for you, I realized there was a lot of crud in what I'd written and needed a lot of cleaning up. I'm going to try and talk about the talk. And then at some point, I'm going to have to go back and look at it. Because I realized that when I was in Turkey, when I finished, I left out what I thought were the most interesting parts of the talk. I don't want to do that again. The idea of globalization goes back very, very, very far. And it begins on the coastlines. So I have a quotation from Plutarch, about 100 BC, talking about how much this trade is encouraging civilization and culture and the exchange of ideas. It was something that could have been written by a politician trying to sell the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I hear Brazil isn't going to do. Is that correct? That's good. So I'm going to begin with the notion that the economist's idea of globalization is such that globalization is based on transactions. And a transaction means that I have something to sell and you have something to buy. We both enter this transaction voluntarily, and each of us thinks we'll be better off. You would have been willing to pay for more, and I would have been willing to accept less. And we still go for it. And we both ideally feel better for the subject. The problem is, in globalization, many of the transactions don't include the people that it affects. It's like you and I make a deal, and part of our agreement is we take everything from Carino, and he's not part of that transaction. So let me give you a couple examples. The first example I will give you is that in Africa, large swaths of land are being taken over by China and by U.S. hedge companies. China, at least, wants the food because it has inadequate agricultural supplies and would like to be able to be in charge of its own food supply. The hedge funds want to go into this agriculture. Why? Because they were betting that food prices would go up. They weren't interested in farming. They were interested in speculating. So what happens is the hedge fund or China goes to some corrupt corporate official and they make a deal. And these other powers are able to get land for $1 or so an acre for 10 years. Now, I would defy you to go out in the farming area around Chico and offer some of the farmers $1 or $2 to rent their land for 10 years. What happens is the people who aren't part of the transaction, the people who lived on the land, they're kicked off the land, and who knows what happens to them. But it's certainly not going to be good. Another concept of transaction came to light when a few years ago, actually more than a decade ago, the press was reporting on frequent dumping of toxic waste in Africa. Frequent dumping of toxic waste in Africa. One of the economists for the World Bank was a man named Lant Pritchard. And apparently Lant Pritchard wrote this paper, and Larry Summers signed it as if he was the author. Now, I don't know if Larry Summers was shifting the blame on Lant Pritchard or if Lant Pritchard was shifting the blame onto Larry Summers. Do people know who Larry Summers is? He's a son of he's the nephew of 2 Nobel Prize winners, Kenneth Arrow, Nobel Prize winning economists, Kenneth Arrow and Paul Samuelson, 2 of the most distinguished economists of the late 20th century. He became one of the youngest tenured, I think the youngest tenured professor at Harvard, and he rose to become the chief economist of the World Bank, and then he became Secretary of the Treasury, and then he became president of Harvard. Summers is someone who's absolutely bright. I always expected that he would become one of the top economists in the country. In terms of power, yes, he has. He's someone with no social skills at all. The problem with gender imbalance at Harvard in the science and technology is that you girls aren't as smart as we boys, according to Larry Summers. He lost his job at Harvard, and then he became a big hedge fund guy. And a lot of what he says is very good, and a lot of what he says is just acting as a mouthpiece for the financial services. He was very nice to me at a conference. I was sharing a session, and he was part of the conference, session, and I needed to be able to use a laptop to retrieve something from a small little computer-like thing I had. And he let me come up to his room. And I won't be able to repeat what he said, but I can give you some, you can get the bleeps in between. And he's yelling and screaming and saying, "You idiot, don't you know?" From what I could gather from the conversation, he was talking to the education minister of Pakistan. And he was telling him it's going to be a great loss for your country, and it's also bad to discriminate against women. This is a guy who says, I can't hire that many women in science and technology because you gals aren't that smart. But he's telling this guy in Pakistan, just yelling and screaming. I don't think it was a diplomatic hit. But anyway, in the memo by Pritchard and/or Summers, they argued that we should take a second look at our outrage over toxic waste dumping. Why should we be concerned about it? Africa is, this is their term, I'd never heard it before, underpolluted. So it would be in their benefit, since they're underpolluted and poor, they could take the pollution, get some money, and they'll be better off. Of course, the people who are making the deal for the money are, again, the corrupt officials, and the people who get the toxic waste are not party of the conversation. So you have these deals made, and other people aren't part of the deal. Let me tell you about another market. You know about it, but you might not think about it as globalization. The market for torture. There's only one country, to my knowledge, that's involved in this market. But the idea is I send him over to you, and your job is to torture him so that we get information out of him. So it's a transaction. The recipient of the victim gets money, they're better off. The United States supposedly gets information, which should make them better off. Everybody benefits from the transaction. Remember, it's supposed to be good for both sides. Well, everyone benefits, well, except that guy who's been waterboarded 50 times. He didn't appreciate it that much. So you have these transactions. They're supposed to be very good, and everyone benefits. Now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that they're trying to cram down our throat, does everyone know about it? It's a trade deal that is intended to include practically everybody except China. It's a way that the U.S. is trying to marginalize China. But it's also a very unusual treaty. First of all, it's a treaty in favor of free trade. That's not true. I could write a treaty on free trade in about 4 sentences. No one will put tariffs. No one will discriminate against anyone else. There won't be any rules that are going to be specifically designed to hurt one country. It'll be very simple. These free trade treaties run into thousands of pages. Well, what does a free trade treaty say? Does anyone know what it says? It was written in secret by corporate lobbyists, and members of Congress were not allowed to see it. They're supposed to vote on it, but they're not allowed to see it. Now they can come in and they can look at a chapter. They have no writing utensils that they're allowed to bring with them, and it'll be violation of the law if they tell anyone what they read. This comes from an administration in which the president had vowed that his administration would be the most transparent administration in history. And I'd say it's transparently in favor of anything the corporate sector wants. So here's this treaty. One of the worst parts of the treaty, and I thought it was the part that Brazil rejected, was dispute resolution committees. And it's a tribunal made up of people who are selected by the corporations who will act as a court and make decisions. And one of the ideas of these dispute resolutions is that nothing is to be done to constrain your future profits. Okay, here's an example. The country of Uruguay thought that, for some reason, I don't know why, that smoking was hazardous to health. And they required that cigarettes have a very strong warning on the package. Philip Morris sued them. Now keep this in mind, that the gross domestic product of Uruguay is less than half the revenues of Philip Morris. Who's going to win that battle? Well, it turned out Uruguay didn't have enough money to hire the kind of lawyers they need. And fortunately, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, formerly of New York, and Bill Gates gave them some money, and that was used to get lawyers. That's the only reason. Oh, and the amount of profit that was lost, it's not that was lost already, it's that lost in the future. And how do we know what the future profits are going to be? Well, Philip Morris has experts, and they can tell us. This is called free trade. For that reason, according to this treaty, financial regulation, banks, not just American banks, banks all over the world, will be able to sue the United States government to recover profits that they would lose because of financial regulation. Sound like free trade? Or does it sound like corporate control? What it means is that the United States is signing away its right to environmental regulations, financial regulations, regulations about pharmaceuticals. So if the pharmaceutical companies say, we think that our patent should be extended, and we think that there should be barriers to people making generic drugs, which are cheaper. And we think that under no circumstances should the government be able to dictate what they pay for drugs. It means that the government gives up control of that. So in effect, what this great globalized trade agreement means is that we're giving more and more and more power to the corporations, and we're restricting the kind of powers that government needs. They don't need powers to spy on us, but they need powers to be able to create a sound regulatory system that protects our economy, that protects our health, and they're giving that up. And we're supposed to applaud this. We're supposed to say it's a wonderful thing. Oh, one of the big, there are two other things that are very, very big. And the only reason we know a little bit about these trade agreements is WikiLeaks got a couple chapters. And the couple chapters were devastating. But I think they're 24 chapters. We don't know what's in these things. One thing we do know is that intellectual property is strengthened. There was a bill that the government tried to get passed a couple years ago called SOPA, and it was an extremely harsh way of putting people in jail and fining them big money if they download music illegally. Any kind of use of the internet that is presumed to be a violation of intellectual property rights is severely punished. And one of the highest priorities of this treaty is to strengthen intellectual property rights. How many of you are going to write your representative and say, oh, vote for this, it sounds really good? I don't think many. Another thing that they want to strengthen in terms of intellectual property rights is genetically modified organisms. No country has the right to prevent this country from selling their genetically modified organisms, regardless of what the people want. Free trade. This is what globalization is about. One of the areas that we had NAFTA, which is supposed to be tremendous prosperity for the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And what happened was Mexico was required to accept our highly subsidized corn. Corn is a major agricultural product in Mexico. So what happened was a large number of Mexican farmers lost their land because they couldn't farm corn profitably. And then we become outraged that these people come over the border and dare to enter our country. So our trade treaties disrupt their country, but they're not allowed to come to our country. Or is it their country? As you can make the case that right now we're standing in Mexico. I suspect most of you have a sneaking suspicion that I'm not very much in favor of how all this is working out. It's also going to work out to your disadvantage. The wages that you get will decline because one of the things the treaty will do will be to facilitate outsourcing of jobs. I would like to tell you about the other side, the benefits that are going to help you and help your life. Unfortunately, I'm either a poor researcher or too stupid. I can't find those benefits. I see all the costs, and I don't see all the benefits. Well, there's one benefit, and that is not for you, but politicians who are willing to vote for this sort of thing will be rewarded in their campaign coffers. You will not be rewarded in the same way. To my knowledge, there is nothing in the Free Trade Treaty that would benefit, it would create benefits such that the majority of people in the country would want them. I don't think it would. Okay. Now let me turn around and let's talk about a different side of globalization and trade. When you go back to what Plutarch was saying, he was talking about the cultural benefits of trade. Because merchants will go around the country, or from country to country rather, in their ships, and they'll find out what other cultures are doing. And they can learn. They can learn a great deal. You people know about the Enlightenment. You've heard about the Enlightenment, I take it. Is that true? All right. The Enlightenment came in large part because traders went to other countries. And they reported all of these interesting ideas. Some were absolute nonsense. I forget where it was, but some of the sailors claimed to have seen trees with heads growing on them, human heads. Sometimes in my classroom, I think maybe there are such plants, but probably not. So all these far-fetched ideas came. But on the other hand, they were getting new ideas, and there was much more exchange of ideas from country to country. So in the early 1600s, middle 1600s, in England, the king chartered the Royal Society. And the Royal Society was one of the centers of the development of new scientific knowledge. Isaac Newton was part of it, and later becomes president of the Royal Society. And they were developing all sorts of things. And the Royal Society was, in many ways, a product of globalization. It was a product of globalization because the merchants who were going around were running into other merchants who were going around, and they were fighting each other. And in fact, the Royal Society was established in the midst of the first of a whole number of wars between Holland and England. Holland was the great imperial power. It had control of New York City, which was called New Amsterdam. It had control in Latin America. It had control over much of Asia. It was the most powerful country in the world. A tiny little swath of sandy land. And they became just a phenomenal economy. The British Navy was eventually able to defeat the Dutch Navy after many, many wars. And the Royal Society was developed with the purpose of developing naval technology, in order to be able to fight against the Dutch. So everyone who's put on the Royal Society has something to do with naval technology. One astrologer. Why do you need an astrologer in the Royal Society? Because they know the movements of the planets, and they probably have pretty good information for helping you navigate around the world. There was one rich man. Why rich man? Because the Royal Society needed some money to keep going. But it was a center of science around the world. But it was science that also had an overriding interest in military prowess. A few years before the Royal Society was founded, the head of the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was the first major corporation in the world, certainly the first global corporation in the world. And they had monopolized the spice trade. And the guy who was running the Dutch East India Company on the ground was a guy named Jan Pieterszoon Koon. Z-O-O-N is a Zoon. And he was, people were reporting back, he was slaughtering whole countries, the whole population of islands, in order to have unrestricted access to the spices. These spices are very important. In Germany, in medieval times, a banker was called a Pfeffermann. If anyone speaks German here, you can correct my pronunciation. Why a Pfeffermann? Pfeffer is the German word for pepper. And pepper was seen as being perhaps even more valuable than gold. Partially because the refrigeration at the time was pretty deficient. And in order to eat rancid meat, spices made it more palatable. So spice trade was incredibly important. And anyway, when people are complaining about all the violence that Jan Pieterszoon Koon is doing, he said, there is no trade without war, and no war without trade, as the two go together. And what we know of globalization is certainly closely associated with conquest. And it's no accident that we see the center of military conflict in the world today, not around spices, not the islands around Indonesia and the like, but places that have oil. That's not an accident. As in World War I, Winston Churchill ran the Navy, and he was the first person to say, we should go from coal to oil. You can put more energy in with oil than you can with coal. Therefore, you have less weight per energy, and you can take your ships farther, and you have to refuel them less often. It's very important to do. So oil becomes very important. And we fight about it. And we get very angry with countries that don't want to play our game in oil. What happened in Iran? Does anyone know the history of Iran? Okay. So what happened?
Well, we put in like a bit of the government.
A what?
The original government. Well, originally Britain wanted to come in, right? Britain and the U.S. wanted to come in for oil. And
No.
then we kind of put in the government.
Britain was in oil. Britain was there for oil.
Yeah.
Britain more or less controlled the government.
Yeah.
Finally, there was a democratic election. And they elected a very modest, almost shy doctor, Mossadegh. And Mossadegh thought that the country could grow faster if the country profited from the oil, instead of letting Britain pump it out. So the CIA got Teddy Roosevelt's son, Kermit Roosevelt, who organized a coup against the government, overthrew the government, and put in the Shah of Iran. The Iranians remember that, and the Shah was somebody who was hated around the country. He was very dictatorial. I have a little experience with the Shah. Sort of at a distance. We never met or shook hands. But I used to have a lot of Iranian students here. And these Iranian students, really nice people, they would come over to the house, and I would lend them books, and we would talk. And the students started telling me, this guy and this guy, they're working with the secret police of Iran. I said, really nice people. We talk. We have a good time together. They're interested in the same things I'm interested in. No, they're with the secret police. So I was on sabbatical in Paris, and I only heard about it afterwards. But the two policemen were shooting into the Nord Avenue apartments where the other Iranian students lived. There was a trial, and in the trial, the prosecution made the other Iranian students look bad, and the shooters got off. Because the other Iranian students had politics that were not clear. Another Iranian student came back years later, and he told me, he said, you know, I went back, and the police told me they knew you borrowed this book from Michael Perelman, you borrowed that book from Michael Perelman. They made him mayor of a town, and then they told him if he complained about corruption, they would put him in jail forevermore on the grounds of corruption. He was not happy about his position. The Shah, I mentioned this to say he was not particularly loved in the country. So there was an uprising led by a priest, a Muslim Ayatollah. And I was in Paris at the time that this was happening, and reading what he was saying, and he sounded really good. He sounded very, very good with what he said. And then we had the Iranian Revolution. And he turned out to be not so good. But the Iranians retaliated for the overthrow of the government, and they took over the American embassy. Oh, one other thing that Kermit Roosevelt did, this is pretty interesting. He appealed to something that hadn't been known before very much. The only other person who knew this was Adolf Hitler. Hitler had a mosque in which he was befriending these radical Islamicists, and the idea was they would help him fight the British. It would make it easier for him to do what he wanted to do. So he's using the Islamicists for this purpose. And interestingly enough, the mosque where many of the 9/11 conspirators came from was the same mosque that Hitler used. So here the United States followed in Hitler's footsteps and used Muslim fundamentalists in order to overthrow President Mossadegh. So here's the Shah, very unpopular. He's thrown out. And when the revolution took place, I think most of the world celebrated Ayatollah Khomeini. He turned out to be something other than we wanted. The Iranians responded by taking over the American embassy and holding people hostage for a while. And that began what we have today between Iran and the United States. But it starts, like you said, about oil. Who controls oil? And when you look at the history of the world, what you see is most of human history revolves around the ability to control energy. It can be energy in the form of food that you eat. It can be energy in terms of wood that you burn. Then it becomes energy in the form of coal. And most of human history can be seen in terms of this ability to harness energy. But now we harness energy so much that we're threatening the entire world. And this brings us to another form of globalization. Because climate change is a dramatic form of globalization. And the solution to climate change has to be globalization. China or the United States cannot by themselves, or any other country can by themselves, put in place a policy that's going to commit to reversing climate change. It's going to take the whole world. It's going to take tremendous cooperation. So here we see something else about globalization. We see that globalization would be good. We need globalization to work about climate change. We need globalization to be able to transmit energy, to change energy, to be able to use it. Interestingly enough, while we have the internet, you would expect globalization to be promoting the free flow of information. It turns out it doesn't. One of the major products of globalization is secrecy rather than information. Secrecy. Most of the hedge funds in the country, I don't know most, but certainly a lot, I would suspect more than half, but I don't know, I can't tell you from data that I can point to. Most of the hedge funds in the United States have their headquarters where? Grand Cayman Islands. The Grand Cayman Islands was, until England figured out how to use it, was just a very poor place. It didn't even have a movie theater. It had nothing. And what they did was they created an island of secrecy. So if you go to the Grand Cayman Islands, you'll see these buildings, and they'll have literally hundreds and hundreds of plaques for different companies. And the company will consist, the Grand Cayman presence of the company will consist maybe of a fax machine, a mailbox, and an internet account. Nobody's there from corporate headquarters. But if you're a curious, good student, and you go and you ask somebody, who owns that company? You go to jail. That's a criminal offense. So this criminal offense means that the Grand Cayman Islands, the most famous of all the tax havens, helps people avoid paying taxes. And then the governments have insufficient taxes, so what do? They find other ways. One way is to cut government spending. And we have state after state now slicing off $300, $400 million worth of spending on education. Arizona just announced that they're going to cut off all funding for community colleges. State after state is cutting education. Another thing they do to compensate for lack of taxes, asset forfeiture. You people know what asset forfeiture is? If there was a guy who had a company and people were telling him, don't put a lot of money in the bank at the same time. So he was putting his corporation's money in the bank at $10,000. That was seen as suspicion that he was trying to hide something illegal, because the bank has to report to the Treasury if someone puts more than $10,000 in an account at one time. Based on this suspected effort to hide his transactions, the guy had everything taken by the government. It's called asset forfeiture. Never was charged with anything. Well, I should tell you, I'm not smart enough to make this stuff up. Never was charged with anything. Has no way of getting his property back. As there's no legal venue where he can say, I didn't do anything. If you're driving around, the police stop you, and you have a joint in your car, they can keep the car. That's asset forfeiture. We saw a big uprising a few weeks ago in Ferguson. One of the problems in Ferguson was the cops had a quota. The cops had a quota of arrests they have to make, and when you arrest someone, then you fine them. And if they can't pay the fine, you arrest them again, and you increase the fine. And then you say, if you can't pay the fine, we're going to put you on probation, and you're going to have to pay $40 a month for your ankle bracelet. And that becomes a major source of revenue. When the mayor of New York seemed to be too friendly to those people who were talking about police violence, the police went on strike. They stopped making as many arrests. Because these are not arrests for ongoing crimes. They're for, if anything, petty thing. You know, you have a broken tail light, something like that. And the mayor of New York backed down, and the arrests came back up. It's a major source of revenue. You people know about another major source of revenue. When I was in graduate school, I didn't pay tuition. Not because it was me. All the other students at the University of California didn't pay tuition. We had to spend a couple $100 a year on a fee, but it hardly ranked as tuition. And because of lack of revenue coming into the treasuries of states and the federal government, we cut back on education, and you people pay for it, because it all fits together. Some of it has to do with globalization. Some of it has to do with the outsourcing of jobs. A lot of it has to do, much more has to do with the hiding of taxes. And the hiding of taxes gives the financial interests, more power. The more power they have, the more they can run the government. And the more they run the government, the worse things get. So if you look at the history of the United States, I guess I'm getting off globalization. Is that okay?
What I was thinking of doing is, we have maybe about 5 minutes because there is another class coming. So
Okay. No, I'd rather have conversation.
yeah. So we could open it up for about 5 minutes. You may have questions to Dr. Perelman.
Michael.
Maybe we start with my question. If we try to, I don't know, maybe we could talk a little bit about hedge fund because some of you may not know that much about what hedge fund is. So maybe you could expand a little bit on that. And the other issue, or the other question is, are you suggesting, for instance, that a solution for the unintended consequences of globalization has to come from within globalization itself?
Within the people. It requires a society in which people are working together, when people are giving each other dignity, and when they're helping them develop. That's what's required. And I'm sure you could talk a bit about Brazil and some of the reforms that Lula put there that really helped people come up. Now, it was neutralized by corruption, but it still did a hell of a lot of good. In terms of a hedge fund is just a thing. Look, maybe I'll start a hedge fund. Give me a few $1,000s. I'll invest it. And I'll keep 20% of the profits. And you get all the rest of the profits, and you'll pay me also 2% of the amount that you give me. So if you give me $2,000, you're going to have to pay $400 a year. And if I lose everything, it's been nice knowing you. That's what a hedge fund is. So when we're finished here, I'll take money and I'll start my own hedge fund. So you can empty your pockets and we're in business. Is that legal? Fortunately, no one will give you the money. But yeah, let's have a conversation. I have more fun listening than talking. So open up for questions, comments, criticisms. Yes?
Aside from theoretical solutions, do you think there are any actionable or tangible solutions, or does it have to come from a theoretical basis first?
Does what have to come from a theoretical basis?
So just like you're saying that, well, you're essentially saying that the corporate world is destroying or abusing the non-corporate world, right? That's your argument?
Yeah.
In a nutshell. And so there's this, well, that's a problem for me as a non-corporate entity. So is there a solution that's actionable for me aside from a theoretical basis?
Yeah. So it happens for a really weird reason. If you go back to the history of the United States, corporations were very, very controversial. And there was a suit between San Mateo County and the Southern Pacific Company. You're familiar with that? Okay, so tell them.
Is this the...
Louder so they can hear.
Is this the, maybe I'm wrong, is this the antitrust?
Pardon?
Is this the antitrust law?
No.
No, okay.
No. What happened was they wanted to tax the property of Southern Pacific Railroad. Southern Pacific Railroad said you can't do that. And they sued under the 14th Amendment, which was the amendment intended to eliminate slavery. And they were claiming, as corporations, they have the same rights that we were giving slaves. The judges said, we're not going to talk about corporations as people. The secretary of the Supreme Court publishes a book in which he summarizes the case. So it doesn't happen from the Supreme Court. It happens from the guy who's writing what the Supreme Court says. And he says, the court decided that corporations have all the rights of people. And that's where we start our downhill spiral. When the corporation buys politicians, that's called free speech. Did that answer your question a bit? So this idea that corporations get, one thing, corporations can kill people, and the cost of killing a worker on the job is less than the cost of harming a monkey in the park. I mean, a donkey in the park. There are no consequences. That is, you saw the banks melt down and make people's, not their own, the people's as a whole losing trillions of dollars that then have to be made up by spending cuts for good things, and nobody went to jail. Nobody went to jail. And corporations can kill people. BP has several instances in which multiple people have died on the job there, but there's no death penalty for BP. So they're persons. Now here's the irony. For example, 2 federal judges wrote an op-ed piece some years ago in the Wall Street Journal, and they said corporations cannot be punished. To be punished, you have to have a guilty mind. And a corporation doesn't have a mind. It's a group of people. So you can't punish the corporation. So it all sounds to me like impunity, no punishment. Now, what we did see after the meltdown, that, this bank would be charged $1 billion, this one $800 million. The banks don't pay that. That comes out of the shareholders' profits. And even if they did pay it, they're dealing with so much money and they make so much profit, it would be a drop in the bucket. For me, $1 billion isn't a drop in the bucket.
Michael, thank you so much. We have to have you back here.
Okay, pleasure.